Nisha Kapoor was only 19, chasing the American dream in New York. Richard Hayes was 48, a wealthy real estate investor with secrets of his own. When their worlds collided in a hidden sugar daddy affair, obsession turned deadly. What began as a promise of luxury ended in betrayal, disappearance, and murder. Nisha Kapoor had just turned 19 when she boarded her first international flight. She had always been known in her Delhi neighborhood as the bright and ambitious daughter who never wasted time. Her parents had saved for years to send her abroad, proudly telling relatives that their daughter would study in America and make a future they could only dream of. New York felt like a shining promise, a city where anything seemed possible. When she arrived, the cold air in late autumn startled her, but she smiled anyway, carrying her small suitcase and big hopes. She enrolled in a community college in Queens, determined to work her way toward transferring to a more prestigious university. Her days were packed with classes, assignments, and a part-time job at a cafe. At first, she enjoyed the independence. She learned how to navigate the subway, how to manage rent with 2 other students in a tiny apartment, and how to stretch her money at cheap grocery stores. But quickly, reality replaced excitement. The bills kept coming, the rent consumed most of her wages, and her parents expected glowing updates rather than cries for help. She could not bring herself to tell them how hard life really was. In her spare time, Nisha scrolled through her phone, looking at pictures of students in the city who dressed in expensive clothes, carried the latest phones, and dined in glittering restaurants. Many of them seemed to live a life she could only admire from afar. She wondered how they afforded it when she was counting every dollar. Late one night, while lying on her bed after a long shift at work, she stumbled onto an advertisement for a sugar dating app. It promised mutually beneficial arrangements, where young women could connect with wealthy older men seeking companionship. At first, she laughed at the idea and swiped past it, but curiosity grew. She began reading stories online of students who paid for tuition, rent, even vacations through such arrangements. Nisha was nervous but also intrigued. She told herself she would just make a profile and see what happened. She uploaded a simple photo and wrote a few lines about being a student in New York. Within hours, messages flooded her inbox. Some were crude and immediately deleted, but one stood out: Richard Hayes. He was a 48-year-old real estate investor, well-spoken, polite, and offering what seemed like security. He wrote about enjoying fine dining, traveling, and helping someone build their dreams. His profile photo showed a man in a tailored suit, smiling in front of a city skyline. Their conversations began innocently. Richard complimented her intelligence, asked about her studies, and shared stories of his career. He didn't pressure her, which made him seem safer than the others. Soon, he offered to meet her in person at a quiet restaurant. Nisha hesitated, but the thought of an easy solution to her financial struggles outweighed the fear. She dressed carefully, told her roommates she had extra work, and left for the meeting. That night changed everything. Richard treated her like she had never been treated before. He pulled out chairs, ordered expensive food she had never tasted, and gave her an envelope with cash before she left. He told her it was just a small gift for her time. Nisha returned to her apartment with shaking hands. She counted the money and realized it equaled 2 weeks of her cafe job. Her heart raced with excitement and dread at once. She knew this path was dangerous, but she also knew she had just tasted a version of life she had always dreamed of. It felt like a secret doorway had opened in New York, one she could step through if she dared. What she didn't realize was that on the other side of that doorway, her future was already beginning to unravel. Nisha's life began to shift in ways that no one around her could fully see. To her family back in Delhi, she was still the hardworking daughter who sent cheerful updates about her classes and the American dream she was chasing. She never mentioned the long nights of exhaustion or the strange new arrangement that was quietly funding her lifestyle. To her roommates, she seemed like the lucky one who always had a little extra cash for better clothes or a taxi ride when the subway felt unsafe. They assumed she had picked up extra shifts at the cafe. Only Nisha knew the truth, and she carried it like a double-edged secret. With Richard, her world was different. He showered her with expensive dinners in dimly lit Manhattan restaurants, designer handbags, and envelopes of cash. At first, it felt like stepping into a movie scene. She could stroll into stores she used to walk past and finally buy things she once thought were too far out of reach. For a 19-year-old who had been struggling with bills, the temptation was irresistible. But with every gift came a hidden price. Richard didn't just give, he demanded. He wanted to know where she was, who she spent time with, and how often she could meet him. Slowly, the line between support and control began to blur. Nisha would receive constant messages from him, checking in, asking why she hadn't responded quickly, or insisting she cancel plans with friends to spend time with him. At first, she excused it as concern, telling herself that older men were naturally protective. But soon she realized that Richard was becoming more than protective. He was possessive. His voice softened when he promised her the world, but it hardened whenever she tried to set boundaries. The pressure grew heavier when she discovered Richard was married. It came not from him, but from a subtle detail she noticed while scrolling through social media. A tagged photo showed him standing beside a woman at a charity event, smiling with the same polished charm he had shown her. The caption identified the woman as Elaine Hayes, his wife of over 20 years. Nisha froze. The revelation turned her stomach, but when she confronted him later, Richard brushed it aside. He told her his marriage was loveless, that his wife was cold and distant, and that Nisha was the only one who made him feel alive again. He promised it was harmless, just a private world between them. Despite her unease, Nisha felt trapped. The money had woven itself into her daily life. Tuition fees were easier to pay, her fridge was no longer empty, and she even managed to send small amounts back home without her parents suspecting how she earned it. But the comfort came with growing chains. Richard began showing up unannounced, waiting outside her campus building and hinting that he didn't want her spending time with boys her age. His charm could flip into cold silence if she didn't obey, and she began to fear his mood swings. Inside, Nisha carried a storm of guilt and fear. She wanted to pull away, but she couldn't imagine going back to the days of sleepless nights worrying about money. She tried to remind herself that it was temporary, that she could walk away when she was stronger. But every day Richard pulled her deeper into a life that no longer felt like hers. She had stepped into an arrangement believing she was in control, but now it seemed like the control belonged entirely to him. And though she did not know it yet, Richard's possessiveness was building into something far more dangerous than she could imagine. By the time spring arrived in New York, Nisha's secret arrangement had become unbearable. What once felt like a solution to her problems now weighed on her like a chain she couldn't break. Richard's grip had tightened in ways she never expected. He wanted constant reassurance, demanded her time, and insisted that she belonged to him alone. Whenever she tried to resist, he reminded her of the money he had spent, the gifts he had given, and the promises he could withdraw. His words were wrapped in control disguised as care, and Nisha began to feel suffocated. She wanted to end things quietly, but the fear of his threats haunted her. Richard had hinted that he had photos of them together, private moments that could ruin her if shared. He told her he had friends in powerful places who could make her immigration status difficult if she ever betrayed him. Each time she thought of breaking free, the risks seemed too high. She tried to convince herself to stay until she finished her semester, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. How much longer could she survive like this? It was around this time that Jason Reed entered the picture more closely. Jason was a quiet classmate, someone who had always admired Nisha from a distance. He noticed her absences in class, the way she sometimes looked tired and distracted, and the faint anxiety that seemed to follow her. One evening after class, when Nisha looked especially restless, Jason struck up a conversation. What began as small talk soon grew into something more. She found herself opening up just a little, admitting that she was involved with someone she wanted to leave. She didn't give him details, but Jason could see her fear. He told her that she deserved better and that she needed to protect herself before things got worse. Jason's concern lingered in her mind. For the first time, She felt someone cared for her without expecting anything in return. She thought about telling him everything but stopped herself. She couldn't risk dragging someone else into Richard's world. Still, the seed of escape began to grow. Nisha decided she would end things with Richard before the situation escalated any further. She rehearsed what she might say, imagining herself standing firm, explaining that she needed to focus on her studies and her future. But Richard sensed her pulling away. His texts became more urgent, his tone more demanding. He accused her of being ungrateful, of using him. He reminded her of everything he had given and threatened that walking away would not be simple. The more distant she grew, the more volatile he became. Nisha's nights filled with sleepless worry. She knew he was capable of manipulation, but she began to wonder if he was capable of something far worse. Despite the fear, Nisha made her decision. She would meet him one last time, look him in the eye, and tell him it was over. She believed that if she stayed calm and reasonable, she could convince him to let her go. It was a dangerous hope, but it was the only way she could see herself free. On the day of their planned meeting, she tucked her phone into her bag, promised herself it would be the final chapter of this secret life, and walked toward Richard's apartment with determination. She didn't know that she was stepping into the most perilous moment of her short life, and that the ending she imagined would never come. The night air in Manhattan carried the hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights as Nisha approached Richard's building. She told herself this would be the last time, the final meeting before she broke free. Her heart raced not just from fear, but from the uncertainty of how he would react. Inside the luxury apartment, the world looked calm and polished. Gleaming floors, glass windows overlooking the city, expensive art on the walls. Yet beneath the surface, tension brewed like a storm about to break. Richard greeted her with his usual smile, but there was a sharpness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. He poured drinks and tried to make conversation, but Nisha's resolve was firm. When she finally spoke, telling him she could not continue, the mask began to crack. His voice rose, disbelief turning quickly into anger. He reminded her of the money, the gifts, the nights he had spent with her. He accused her of betrayal, of playing with his feelings. The calm tone of a wealthy man was gone, replaced by the fury of someone who refused to lose control. The argument spiraled. Nisha tried to stay steady, but Richard's words cut deeper with every sentence. He shouted that she owed him, that she was nothing without his help, that walking away was not an option. She moved toward the door, ready to leave, but he blocked her path. Panic set in as she realized how trapped she was inside those walls. Her hands shook, her voice faltered, and for the first time she saw him not as the man who had once dazzled her with wealth, but as a predator cornering his prey. In a burst of rage, Richard struck her. The blow sent her stumbling, and she fell hard against the edge of a table. The sound echoed in the room, followed by silence that seemed to stretch forever. Nisha tried to get up, but Richard, overcome with anger and fear of losing her, pressed down with violence she could not resist. In those moments, desperation overpowered reason. He did not stop until the life drained from her eyes, leaving only stillness where there had once been defiance. For a long time he stood frozen, staring at what he had done. The room felt smaller, suffocating. He had crossed a line that could never be erased. At first, he whispered to himself that it was an accident, that she had pushed him too far, that no one would understand. But then the panic grew louder than his excuses. He needed to hide what happened. He dragged her lifeless body to the bedroom, pacing the apartment as he thought of what to do. Every clock tick seemed like a countdown toward discovery. Hours later, under the cover of midnight, Richard wrapped her in a blanket and carried her down to his car parked in the garage. He avoided eye contact with the night guard, his movements carefully rehearsed in his mind. He drove across the Hudson River into New Jersey, the city lights fading behind him. The further he went, the darker the roads became, lined with trees that offered a chilling kind of cover. Finally, he pulled over at a remote wooded area. With shaking hands, he dragged her into the brush and left her there. hidden beneath fallen branches and leaves. The night was silent, broken only by his ragged breathing. He returned to his car, the weight of his actions pressing against his chest, and drove back toward Manhattan as if nothing had happened. Back in the apartment, he scrubbed the floor, washed his hands until they burned, and erased every trace he could find. To the world, Nisha Kapoor had simply disappeared into the vastness of New York City. Only Richard Hayes knew the truth of what lay hidden in the shadows of New Jersey. When Nisha failed to show up to her classes the following week, her absence was first brushed off as exhaustion or perhaps illness. But when days turned into silence, her roommates grew worried. They checked her side of the apartment and noticed her textbooks and laptop were still there. The cafe where she worked part-time confirmed she hadn't shown up for her shifts either. Calls to her phone went unanswered, messages remained unread. What unsettled everyone most was the fact that Nisha had never been careless. She was always punctual, always responsible. Something was wrong. Jason Reed, who had grown close to her in recent weeks, was the first to connect her disappearance with the mysterious older man she had mentioned. He told police that Nisha had spoken of someone wealthy, someone who seemed controlling. Investigators traced her phone records and discovered repeated calls and texts to Richard Hayes. At first, his name meant nothing to them, but when they searched his background and found his reputation as a successful real estate investor, they began to dig deeper. The first major breakthrough came from the security cameras in Richard's building. The footage showed Nisha walking into the lobby on the night she vanished. She never came out again. That single image painted a grim picture. Detectives confronted Richard at his apartment, where he appeared calm and collected. He told them Nisha had visited but left soon after, claiming he had no idea where she had gone. His tone was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man used to negotiation. But the investigators were not convinced. As they combed through his apartment, small details began to raise suspicion. The faint smell of bleach lingered in one room. Carpets seemed freshly scrubbed. Though nothing outright incriminating was visible, the atmosphere told a different story. They pressed Richard harder, pointing out the contradictions in his account. His calm demeanor began to crack. He grew defensive, then silent, then agitated. Days later, a jogger in a wooded area of New Jersey stumbled upon what the police had been dreading. Beneath a pile of branches and leaves, the body of a young woman was discovered. The identification was swift. It was Nisha Kapoor. The news spread quickly through campus, her neighborhood, and all the way back to Delhi, where her parents received the devastating call they had never imagined. Their daughter, who had left with dreams of a brighter future, had been silenced in a foreign land. The evidence mounted against Richard Hayes. Phone records, building footage, and forensic analysis tied him directly to Nisha's last known moments. Confronted with the weight of proof, Richard finally confessed, though he tried to frame it as a moment of anger, a tragic accident. But prosecutors saw through his story. They painted a portrait of a man consumed by greed, control, and obsession, who believed his wealth entitled him to ownership over a vulnerable young woman. The trial drew national attention. Newspapers splashed the story of the Indian student and her secret arrangement with a wealthy married man. Courtrooms filled with reporters, each detail of Nisha's life laid bare for the world to see. The defense argued for manslaughter, citing loss of temper. The prosecution demanded justice, emphasizing the premeditation in his cleanup and disposal of her body. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Richard Hayes was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The polished man who once lived in a high-rise apartment would now spend his days in a prison cell. But the victory felt hollow. A life had been taken, a dream destroyed, and a family left in mourning. Nisha's story became a warning whispered among young students, a reminder of how quickly ambition could be exploited, how charm could mask danger, and how secret arrangements carried risks far greater than they seemed. Her name, once tied to the promise of hope, now stood as a symbol of how easily a future can be stolen.